One of the joys of life for me is to be able to pick up a book, and I have several on my shelves, from the old days and read what life was like. I've been reading this absolutely charming book by a gentleman called George Sturt. It's called The Wheelwright's Shop. And he was an author who wrote several books. I think he had a pen name or a nom de plume, whatever you want to call it, as well. Not only his George Sturt, but also George Bourne, I think. But anyway, he wrote several books. But he was brought up by his father, of course, and his grandfather before him had purchased a genuine wheelwright's shop and was a wheelwright. You try saying that several times. And then his father inherited that, and when his father died, George himself inherited the shop. But his main passion, it seems, was for writing. But he writes this book and talks about the shop when he took it over and the time of those old days when men knew their crafts. They knew how to make things with their own hands. And he talks about how everything back then had to be done properly. This was before the First World War, sort of in the 1920s. I think he publishes this in 1927 or something like that. And he talks about the time just before the turn of the century and his involvement in this. And he's talking to these old hands who knew, these boys who knew how things were done. They would look at the wood, they would measure the wood, they knew, the master wheelwright knew the dimensions. They didn't use tape measures and things like that. They were just so crafted in what they did, and they knew what was right and what was proper. They worked long hours and they created everything. Even from, so a wheelwright wouldn't just be making the wheels, although that would be one of the things they would do, but they would do all sorts of things like these wagons, the whole wagon, and the building of the wagon, the carving of all the woods and various bits, and fixing and joining and putting it together, and then the painting and everything. And they would make the paint from scratch. And it's fascinating to listen to or to read and observe with this incredible writing skill how these things used to be done in the old days, and the pride and the attention to detail. He says that, you know, back then, things before the war, things were made to last. The wood was sourced locally. It was a very rural area that he was in, and the wood was sourced locally. Certain trees had been felled. They knew which trees, as he calls them, thrown. They had been thrown, and they would sit there. Certain trees would be lying, seasoning for a longer time. Some would have their bark on them. Some would have had their bark removed so that the bark could be used for tanning. But they would know, and they would be seeing in the tree, in and of itself, what bits of wood they would be using to build the various things that they were asked to build, the wagons, the carts, the harrows, and all sorts of things. And they would know. And it's so interesting going back and reading that time. And I think to myself, you know, here we are in this modern age, and he talks about the coming of the First World War. And when the First World War, trees were felled left, right and centre to make very quickly various, I guess, armaments and all sorts of things, pit shafts, I suppose, for the trenches and things like that, braces and all of that. And he said it was terrible. There was this huge denuding of the forests, trees that they'd had their eye on, thinking, oh, the grain in there is perfect, or the shape of that particular bough is going to fit a certain type of wagon that they would need on the farms. Absolutely amazing stuff. And then in comes the war. And then after that, we start to see the mechanization. And of course, he starts to see the old ways, the old crafts, the pride and the satisfaction of men who worked very hard and knew their business being eroded. And here we are 100 years or so later. And we now see that a lot of people's jobs are not quite as satisfying as perhaps one would expect it. Of course, we live in a completely different age. But there is, I think, something about that ability to create something with your own hands as much as you can from scratch, from natural ingredients. And in this modern age, we see so much of things being plastic or templates for things. And that ability, that individual ability to craft something ourselves and have all that knowledge which we've gained over time is not as easy these days to come across. These old crafts are no longer in demand because you can nip down to some superstore and it's all massively made in mechanisation. And we've already glimpsed that the future is there with AI, this artificial intelligence and bigger computers. And so where do we fit in? And I would urge that we fit in by going back to some of those crafts and learning them for ourselves, and not just acquiescing to a future that has been mapped out for us, because in a way this technology has robbed us of what it is to thrive. Now, of course, there are many people who do craft things. Perhaps they make things out of wool, you know, knitting and crochet and various other things. There'd be some hobbyist people. But I would love to see, I mean, for myself, I would love to know how to do these old crafts and find time and build a workshop in which I could actually create. I did once create a table, but it was just screwed together. But that's a start, you know. It's not just going and buying something. It's having the satisfaction to do it. And in many ways, I think being creative is a way to understand what life is about. If we're just in a world where we turn up for work, we feel that we've got to work these long hours and we're effectively minding the machine or going through the motions, we're not engaged, we're not being creative, we're being told what to do by managers and line managers and, you know, policies and things like that in corporate worlds, you find that you do not really have that sense of being alive. Working with natural products, with natural things, gives you a sense that you're connected to this planet, to the earth, to life itself. And I would urge people to think about that instead of perhaps coming in and just flopping and sitting in front of screens and going, wow, you know, there I was in the call centre today under fluorescent light and front of screens, and now I'm at home watching the telly and listening to whatever the mainstream media is telling me. I would urge people to sort of switch all that stuff off. Find what it is that makes you want to be, that really satisfies your soul. There's so much negativity in this world at the moment. There's so much things being played down. There's so many bad messages to keep us in fear and stop us from being creative, to stop us thriving. Now, maybe you've got an allotment and you're interested in growing certain things. And of course, there's all sorts of different ways to do it. People are exploring all sorts of different avenues. For example, somebody sent me a link today about the old ways. So many things in the old ways we've forgotten. I forget what it's called. It's something to do with electro gardening or something. And you put in things like copper pipes or small circuits. And somehow they were showing these massive, great big cauliflowers and huge cabbages and big marrows that people used to grow. And then you go to the supermarket and you see these mass-produced things which have no nutrients in them, and they're small and mean, and they last in your bag or in your shelf or wherever just for a few hours, and they seem to go off very quickly. And yet, in those old days, in the days of before all this modern technology, it did seem that people were able to grow wholesome stuff, bigger stuff, more interesting, and have much more connected lives. Communities, of course, were relying on one another. People were knocking on their doors. People didn't lock their back door, did they? They would knock on, ooh, have you got this? Could I borrow that? How are you, Reenie? And all that sort of stuff. Now, it may be that part of this is looking down the line in history with rose-tinted glasses, and people like George Sturt is writing about very small numbers of society. But having read books on lots of farming stuff, even though people were simpler and they didn't have all the sort of technology that we have today, they had a respect. They had a respect for the land, for the environment, for the trees, and they would do nothing to mar that. And often some of the labourers who were being asked by the farmer to change certain ways for modernisation would be going, oh, that ain't so good, that ain't going to work. And here we are, we've seen how a lot of this modernisation, this high-tech stuff, has actually turned out not to be as beneficial for us. So many times there's things that have been hidden. I think the last 100 years has been an interesting experiment, a lot of which I don't think we should do ever again. The high industrialization of food, for example, the pesticides, the herbicides, and all of this. And it seems that only now we're beginning to realize the error of our ways. And yet some people have been shouting this from the chandeliers or from the balconies, saying, I don't think this is good. We're losing the topsoil. We're losing the integrity. We're following what big industry wants. Back in the days when you had to do everything yourself and you were creative, there was a certain, I don't know what you would call it, a magic, if you like. It may have been harder, it may have been laborious, we may not have had all the luxuries, there may have been many of the other problems, but there was a certain level of respect, there was a certain dependence on one another, that people had a creative bent inside them and they could solve problems. These days it seems that unless there's a shop that sells it, we cannot find the answer, or we have to quickly go online to get the answer. We seem to be dumbing ourselves down. But we're not dumb. We are incredible people. And I think partly we've lost that. We've lost the sense that we are very creative, very innovative, and incredible people. And we've almost allowed all of that to be taken away from us by the big corporations, by buying everything already done, that we no longer have to sort of create things for ourselves or give things a try. Because when we do that, when you do something for yourself, there's a huge amount of pride and satisfaction. And that's one thing that I think will help us get through these somewhat difficult times, is believing in ourselves, in our own creativity, being positive and not always handing everything over for somebody else to do, and so that we don't have any respect for the end product. If we do it ourselves, we will thrive.